Fear arrives first as a bodily sensation, tightening the throat before the mind has time to interpret it. Breath grows shallow, not from exertion but from anticipation, as though the air itself has become rationed. For the prisoners, this moment is suspended between what has already been lost and what they assume is about to be taken next. Time stretches unnaturally, every second elongated by the awareness of vulnerability. They stand or sit in enforced stillness, bodies close, yet each man sealed within his own private dread. The uncertainty is more punishing than any immediate blow, because imagination fills the silence with rehearsed horrors drawn from rumor, memory, and the long shadow of war's reputation. Captivity, in their minds, has already been defined. Long before this moment, stories have circulated through camps, trenches, and whispered conversations, tales of ridicule, deliberate degradation, and psychological torment designed to break not only the body but the will. These stories are absorbed as survival knowledge, passed from one soldier to another like warnings etched into instinct. To be captured, they believe, is to be stripped of identity, reduced to an object upon which the victor performs dominance. Mockery is expected not as an exception but as a ritual, a way for captors to assert superiority and erase the humanity of those who have fallen into their control. As fear tightens its grip, dignity feels like the first casualty. The prisoners understand, or think they do, that dignity has little place here. War has taught them that power expresses itself loudly, often cruelly, and rarely with restraint. They brace themselves for laughter at their expense, for exaggerated gestures meant to humiliate, for the slow grinding process by which individuals are turned into numbers or burdens. In this psychological preparation, there is a grim efficiency. If one expects the worst, perhaps the shock will be less devastating when it arrives. Their bodies bear the marks of exhaustion and defeat. Uniforms are rumpled, torn, or stained, once symbolic garments now serving only as reminders of lost structure and purpose. Faces are drawn, eyes alert yet dulled by fatigue. Hunger, thirst, and physical discomfort press in from all sides, but they are secondary to the fear of what comes next. The men exchange glances sparingly, cautious not to reveal weakness or provoke attention. Even among comrades, vulnerability feels dangerous, as though acknowledging fear might somehow invite its fulfillment. The environment amplifies the tension. The setting, whether a yard, a road, a temporary holding area, feels stripped of detail, reduced in the prisoner's perception to a few threatening elements: armed guards, unfamiliar insignia, the sound of boots or distant machinery. Ordinary sensory input becomes distorted under stress. A raised voice elsewhere sounds closer than it is. A sudden movement triggers flinches that ripple through the group. Each minor stimulus is interpreted through the lens of expectation, reinforcing the belief that humiliation is imminent. This belief does not arise from paranoia alone but from accumulated experience. War, by this stage, has demonstrated repeatedly how quickly civility can collapse. The prisoners have seen villages burned, rules ignored, and lives reduced to strategic inconveniences. They have learned that moral codes often dissolve under pressure, replaced by expedience or vengeance. As such, they see no reason to expect mercy, let alone respect. In their internal calculus, cruelty seems not only likely but logical, an extension of the conflict by other means. Yet beneath this hardened expectation lies a quieter, more fragile layer of emotion. Despite everything, there remains a faint, almost embarrassing hope that the stories might be exaggerated, that this particular moment might deviate from the pattern. This hope is rarely acknowledged, even internally, because it feels dangerous. To hope is to risk disappointment, and disappointment in captivity can be devastating. Still, it flickers in the background, coexisting uneasily with dread. The prisoner's sense of self wavers in this moment. Stripped of weapons, rank insignia, and autonomy, they struggle to locate their identity. Are they still soldiers, or have they already become something else? The fear of mockery is not only about emotional pain but about the symbolic destruction of who they believe themselves to be. To be mocked is to be told, without words, that one's past actions, sacrifices, and beliefs are meaningless. It is an attack on narrative as much as on morale. As they wait, mental rehearsals play out. Some prepare themselves to remain silent no matter what, believing stoicism to be the last defense of dignity. Others plan to endure with visible defiance, imagining that refusal to react might preserve a sense of control. These strategies are imagined shields, constructed hastily but clung to desperately. The prisoners know, intellectually, that such plans may crumble under real pressure, yet the act of planning offers a thin sense of agency in an otherwise powerless situation. Fear also isolates. Even though the prisoners share the same physical space, each man experiences the moment differently. One might be haunted by the thought of family left behind, another by the shame of capture, another by the sheer unpredictability of human behavior under war. These private fears do not align neatly, and so the group feels less like a collective and more like an accidental gathering of solitary minds. The absence of reassurance, spoken or unspoken, deepens the emotional strain. There is also an acute awareness of being observed. The prisoners feel themselves reduced to surfaces to be judged, assessed, perhaps ridiculed. Every movement feels magnified, every posture potentially interpreted as weakness or insolence. This self-consciousness feeds the fear, creating a loop in which anticipation of mockery makes the prisoners more tense, and that tension, they believe, will only invite further humiliation. In this charged stillness, the concept of dignity becomes abstract, almost theoretical. It is something spoken of in training manuals and patriotic speeches, but here it feels impractical, even naive. The prisoners suspect that dignity is a privilege reserved for those who hold power, not those subjected to it. And yet, paradoxically, it is dignity they fear losing most. Not life, not comfort, but the internal sense of worth that allows a person to endure suffering without being erased by it. This moment, heavy with expectation, represents the psychological threshold of captivity. Nothing has yet happened, but everything feels as though it already has. The prisoners stand at the edge of a narrative they believe they know by heart, one written by countless examples of cruelty and reinforced by the logic of war. Fear tightens not only their throats but their understanding of what is possible. They await mockery as an inevitability, bracing for the confirmation that war spares no space for restraint or humanity. And in that waiting, fear becomes both a shield and a prison. It prepares them to survive humiliation, yet it also confines their imagination, allowing no room for surprise. The emotional weight of this anticipation presses down relentlessly, shaping their perception of the captors before any action is taken. The stage is set not by what is happening, but by what the prisoners are convinced must happen next, and it is within this belief that the true power of fear reveals itself. The arrival of the captors does not unfold the way fear has meticulously rehearsed it. Instead of shouted commands or theatrical displays of dominance, there is an unsettling calm that settles over the space. Movements are deliberate rather than aggressive, efficient rather than performative. The prisoners register this first as confusion, their minds momentarily lagging behind what their eyes are seeing. They had prepared for noise, for chaos, for the emotional release of cruelty, yet what confronts them is order. This restraint feels alien, almost misplaced, within the broader logic of war they have come to accept. Uniforms are neat, posture controlled, expressions contained. The captors do not rush, nor do they linger unnecessarily. Their authority is evident, but it is expressed quietly, through structure rather than spectacle. Instructions are given without embellishment, and procedures follow one another with mechanical precision. For the prisoners, this composure is disorienting. It denies them the emotional cues they expected to navigate the moment. Without mockery or visible hostility, fear has no clear target, no behavior to anchor itself to. The absence of immediate cruelty creates a vacuum. Into this silence, the prisoners' expectations echo back at them, unanswered. They wait for laughter that does not come, for insults that never arrive. Every second stretches, not with dread alone but with uncertainty. The captor's restraint feels almost like a test, as though humiliation has merely been delayed for greater effect. Suspicion hardens quickly, because hope feels irresponsible. The prisoners scan faces, searching for cracks in the composure, signs that the civility will soon give way to something more familiar and brutal. Yet the restraint persists. Procedures continue with an almost bureaucratic neutrality. Weapons remain present, a reminder of power, but they are not brandished for effect. The captors do not seek eye contact unnecessarily, nor do they avoid it. Their gaze is professional, appraising without being demeaning. This manner unsettles the prisoners more deeply than open hostility might have. Cruelty, at least, follows predictable patterns. Calm restraint does not. The prisoners begin to feel the weight of this unexpected conduct pressing inward. Their psychological defenses, built to absorb humiliation, find nothing to deflect. The mental armor designed for mockery now feels heavy and useless. Without the anticipated trigger, fear turns inward, morphing into self-questioning. Have they misunderstood their situation? Is this composure a temporary mask, or does it represent something more deliberate, more ingrained? As moments pass, the captor's discipline becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. It is not the politeness of individuals but the consistency of a system. Each action reinforces the impression that restraint is not an exception here but a standard. This realization introduces a subtle shift in the prisoner's emotional landscape. Fear remains, but it no longer dominates unchallenged. Confusion and cautious curiosity begin to intermingle with dread, creating a more complex emotional state that resists easy categorization. The prisoners' bodies respond before their minds fully catch up. Shoulders lower slightly, breath deepens almost imperceptibly. These small physical adjustments occur despite conscious efforts to remain guarded. The nervous system, attuned to immediate threats, registers the lack of aggression even as the intellect resists drawing conclusions. This involuntary response feels dangerous, as though relaxation itself might invite betrayal. The prisoners fight it instinctively, stiffening again, wary of allowing themselves to believe what their senses suggest. Memory intrudes at this stage, recalling earlier assumptions and deeply embedded narratives about enemy behavior. The prisoners struggle to reconcile these memories with the present reality. War, after all, has rarely rewarded optimism. They remind themselves that restraint does not equal mercy, that dignity can coexist with cruelty, that the absence of mockery now does not preclude brutality later. This internal debate plays out silently, each man weighing the evidence against his own experience and fears. The captor's composure also introduces a subtle inversion of power dynamics at the psychological level. By refusing to perform dominance theatrically, they deny the prisoners a familiar script. There is no humiliation to resist, no insult to endure with stoic defiance. Instead, the prisoners are confronted with their own expectations, forced to recognize how thoroughly they had internalized the idea that cruelty was inevitable. This realization carries its own discomfort, exposing the extent to which fear had already shaped their understanding of the enemy. In the quiet efficiency of the captor's actions, there is an implicit message, though no words are exchanged. Power, it suggests, does not require ridicule to be effective. Authority can be exercised without emotional excess, without the need to degrade. This unspoken assertion unsettles the prisoners because it challenges a core belief forged by prolonged exposure to violence. If cruelty is not necessary, then its prevalence elsewhere demands explanation, and that line of thought is dangerously destabilizing. As time passes, the prisoners begin to notice details they might otherwise have missed. The orderly way individuals are processed, the lack of arbitrary punishment, the consistency of treatment. None of this erases the reality of captivity, but it alters its texture. Captivity here feels procedural rather than personal, administered rather than inflicted. This distinction, subtle though it is, has profound psychological implications. It reframes the prisoner's suffering as a consequence of war rather than an expression of contempt. This reframing does not bring comfort so much as cognitive strain. The prisoners must now hold two conflicting truths at once. They are powerless, yet not deliberately humiliated. They are enemies, yet not treated as objects of ridicule. Holding these contradictions requires mental effort, especially under stress. Some respond by retreating further into suspicion, convinced that the civility masks a deeper strategy. Others begin, reluctantly, to acknowledge that something genuinely different may be unfolding. The captor's dignity, expressed through restraint, becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. It manifests not in grand gestures but in the cumulative effect of consistency. Each moment without mockery adds weight to the impression, eroding the prisoner's certainty that degradation is imminent. This erosion is not welcomed. It feels like the ground shifting beneath their feet. Certainty, even of suffering, can be psychologically stabilizing. Uncertainty, especially when it challenges deeply held beliefs, is far more unsettling. The prisoners also become aware of how this restraint reflects back on themselves. Without overt provocation, their own behavior feels more exposed. There is no clear enemy action to react against, no insult to justify defiance or despair. They must confront their own fear more directly, without the distraction of immediate cruelty. In this way, the captor's composure inadvertently forces the prisoners into a deeper engagement with their internal state. Gradually, the initial shock of restraint evolves into a quiet, pervasive unease. The prisoners sense that something significant is happening, though they cannot yet articulate it. The absence of mockery is not merely a missing element, it is an active presence, shaping the emotional atmosphere. It forces a reconsideration of assumptions, a recalibration of expectations. The prisoners realize, perhaps for the first time, that their understanding of the enemy may have been incomplete, shaped as much by fear as by fact. This realization does not inspire trust, but it does inspire attention. The prisoners watch more closely now, listening not for insults but for patterns. They become students of restraint, observing how consistently it is maintained. Each restrained gesture, each neutral interaction, compounds the sense that this is not an act. The captor's dignity appears practiced, institutional, and therefore more powerful than any display of cruelty could have been. By the end of this phase, the emotional terrain has been irrevocably altered. Fear remains, but it has lost its singular dominance. In its place exists a complex mix of suspicion, confusion, and reluctant acknowledgement. The prisoners have not been mocked, and that fact alone has introduced a moral tension they cannot easily resolve. They stand now not only as captives but as witnesses to a form of power that unsettles precisely because it refuses to behave as expected. What begins to surface in this stage is not an act of kindness but a sustained posture, one that reveals itself through repetition rather than declaration. The dignity on display does not announce itself, nor does it seek recognition. It exists in the steady adherence to rules, in the refusal to exploit vulnerability even when doing so would be effortless. For the prisoners, this realization emerges slowly as the mind lags behind the accumulation of evidence. Each interaction reinforces the same pattern, and with every repetition the possibility that this restraint is deliberate becomes harder to dismiss. This dignity expresses itself most clearly through discipline. Movements remain controlled, voices measured, procedures consistent. There is no indulgence in emotion, positive or negative. The captors do not soften their authority, but neither do they sharpen it through humiliation. Power is exercised cleanly, stripped of ornament. This clarity forces the prisoners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Domination does not require cruelty to be effective. The absence of mockery is not a lapse but a choice, one rooted in a different understanding of what authority means. As this understanding takes shape, it begins to unsettle the prisoners' internal narratives. They had relied on the predictability of cruelty to structure their expectations. Cruelty, after all, simplifies the moral landscape. It confirms the enemy as monstrous and justifies hatred as a form of psychological survival. Dignity, by contrast, complicates everything. It resists easy categorization, blurring the boundaries between oppressor and victim without erasing them. The captors remain enemies, yet they do not behave as enemies are supposed to behave. This complication carries emotional consequences. Hatred, once a straightforward response, now feels less stable. It does not vanish, but it loses some of its certainty. The prisoners find themselves grappling with conflicting impulses, the instinct to resist and the involuntary recognition of restraint. This internal friction is exhausting, demanding constant mental adjustment. To acknowledge dignity in the enemy feels like a betrayal of one's own suffering, yet to deny it outright requires ignoring what is plainly visible. The captor's conduct also reflects back on the prisoner's sense of self. Dignity, once thought to belong exclusively to those with moral high ground or physical freedom, appears here as a practice independent of circumstance. This realization forces a re-evaluation of what dignity actually is. It is no longer merely an internal posture or a rhetorical ideal but a set of behaviors enacted under pressure. The captors, operating within a system of war, choose restraint repeatedly, suggesting that dignity is not extinguished by conflict but tested by it. For the prisoners, this testing becomes personal. They begin to feel their own dignity under scrutiny, not by overt challenge but by contrast. Without provocation, their reactions carry greater weight. Each flinch, each moment of bitterness or despair, feels exposed. The absence of humiliation removes the excuse to collapse inward. The prisoners sense, perhaps dimly, that how they respond now matters in a different way. They are no longer merely enduring cruelty, they are navigating a moral environment that demands self-awareness. This environment destabilizes familiar coping mechanisms. Defiance loses some of its clarity when there is nothing obvious to defy. Silence, once a shield against insult, now feels ambiguous. Even endurance, traditionally measured against suffering inflicted, becomes harder to quantify. The prisoners must redefine resilience in the absence of overt cruelty. This redefinition is uncomfortable because it forces them to engage with their own agency, limited though it is, rather than positioning themselves solely as recipients of harm. The captor's dignity also challenges the prisoner's assumptions about national character and wartime identity. Propaganda and rumor had painted the enemy in broad strokes, emphasizing brutality as an inherent trait. The behavior now witnessed does not align with those portrayals. This discrepancy introduces doubt not only about the captors but about the narratives the prisoners themselves have absorbed. If these stories are incomplete or exaggerated, what else might they have misunderstood? This doubt does not lead immediately to trust. Instead, it deepens the psychological complexity of captivity. The prisoners are forced to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The war remains real and violent. They remain powerless, yet the individuals overseeing their captivity are exercising restraint. This coexistence of facts resists simplification. It demands a more nuanced understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions, an understanding that is intellectually demanding and emotionally taxing. Over time, the captor's discipline begins to feel almost ritualistic. It is not rigid for its own sake but purposeful, reinforcing a framework within which actions occur. This framework provides predictability, and predictability, even under captivity, offers a strange form of stability. The prisoners learn what to expect, not in terms of kindness but in terms of consistency. This consistency reduces some of the ambient fear, replacing it with a quieter, more contemplative unease. In this quieter space, reflection becomes unavoidable. The prisoners start to consider the broader implications of what they are experiencing. If dignity can be maintained here, under conditions of absolute power imbalance, then it is not as fragile as they once believed. This realization carries both comfort and burden. Comfort, because it suggests that humanity can persist even in captivity. Burden, because it implies a responsibility to recognize that humanity, even when doing so, complicates one's own narrative of victimhood. The captor's restraint also reframes the meaning of strength. Strength here is not expressed through domination or cruelty but through self-control. The ability to refrain from humiliation, despite having every opportunity to indulge in it, suggests a form of moral discipline. This form of strength is unfamiliar to the prisoners, who have seen strength most often equated with violence. Encountering a different model forces a re-evaluation of deeply ingrained assumptions about power and masculinity forged in wartime. This re-evaluation is not purely intellectual, it is visceral. The prisoners feel the shift in their bodies as well as their minds. Tension that once stemmed from anticipated mockery now arises from uncertainty about how to position themselves emotionally. They are caught between vigilance and reluctant respect, between fear and a growing awareness of restraint. This tension is not resolved quickly, nor is it comfortable. It lingers, shaping each subsequent interaction. As dignity continues to be demonstrated without deviation, it becomes impossible to attribute it to chance or individual temperament alone. It is systemic, embedded in the conduct of the captors as a group. This systemic quality lends it weight, transforming what might have been dismissed as isolated decency into a defining characteristic of the encounter. The prisoners begin to understand that they are witnessing not just personal behavior but an institutional choice about how power should be exercised. This understanding deepens the moral reversal at the heart of the experience. The expected narrative, cruel victor, humiliated captive, fails to materialize. In its place emerges a more ambiguous reality, one in which dignity functions as a quiet but potent force. It does not liberate the prisoners, but it alters the psychological terms of their captivity. It forces them to confront the possibility that moral clarity is not monopolized by one side of a conflict. By this point, the prisoners recognize that something irreversible has occurred within them. Their perception of the enemy has been altered, not softened but complicated. The simplicity of hatred has been disrupted, replaced by a more layered understanding that resists easy resolution. This shift does not lessen their desire for freedom or negate the suffering of war, but it reshapes the emotional framework through which they interpret their experience. In this stage, dignity emerges as a silent presence, exerting influence without fanfare. It shocks not through spectacle but through consistency. For the prisoners, its impact is profound precisely because it was unexpected. It forces a reckoning with the idea that even in war, even in captivity, choices remain. And it is this recognition, that restraint itself is a choice, that marks the deepest transformation of this chapter, leaving the prisoners irrevocably changed in how they understand power, humanity, and themselves. As the days progress under this unexpected regime of restraint, the prisoners begin to experience a quieter, more internal struggle. The shock of dignity has faded into something more unsettling, moral dissonance. The mind, long conditioned to expect cruelty, now has to reconcile an experience that does not fit its assumptions. This reconciliation is neither smooth nor comforting. Instead, it introduces a persistent tension, one that hums beneath every interaction and refuses to be ignored. The captor's behavior has not changed the prisoner's circumstances, yet it has altered the psychological rules by which those circumstances are interpreted. Gratitude becomes the most dangerous emotion to surface. It appears uninvited, slipping into moments of relief when mockery fails to arrive, when procedures remain fair, when humiliation is withheld. The prisoners instinctively recoil from it. Gratitude toward an enemy feels like a betrayal, of comrades still fighting, of losses already endured, of the suffering that made this war necessary in the first place. They push the feeling down, labeling it weakness or confusion, yet it resurfaces repeatedly, stubborn and unresolved. Suspicion quickly rises to counterbalance it. The prisoners tell themselves that restraint must serve a purpose, that dignity may be strategic rather than moral. Perhaps it is designed to extract compliance, to lull them into passivity, to soften resistance before harsher measures are introduced. This interpretation restores a sense of familiar logic, allowing fear to reclaim its place as a rational response. And yet, as time passes without escalation, suspicion begins to fray. The expected pivot toward cruelty does not come. The prisoners find themselves trapped between two unsatisfying explanations. Either the captor's restraint is genuine, which destabilizes long-held beliefs about the enemy, or it is a deception so sustained and consistent that it borders on absurdity. Neither option offers psychological relief. To accept genuine restraint requires revising one's moral framework in the middle of trauma. To cling to suspicion requires constant vigilance against a threat that never materializes. Both positions exhaust the mind. This exhaustion manifests in subtle ways. Sleep becomes restless, not from immediate danger but from unresolved tension. Thoughts circle endlessly, replaying interactions, searching for hidden meanings. Every neutral gesture is dissected, every procedural fairness examined for ulterior motives. The prisoners become analysts of behavior, attempting to decode a system that refuses to confirm their fears. This relentless interpretation drains emotional energy, leaving them simultaneously calmer and more unsettled than before. The moral landscape of captivity begins to blur. Traditionally, war simplifies morality by necessity. Sides are drawn sharply, and survival depends on clarity. Good and evil are assigned, reinforced, and rarely questioned in the heat of conflict. Here, however, that clarity dissolves. The captor's restraint introduces grayness where black and white once dominated. The prisoners are not treated as equals, but neither are they treated as objects of contempt. This intermediate position is psychologically disorienting. In this blurred space, the prisoners confront an uncomfortable truth about themselves. Much of their own emotional armor had been built on certainty that the enemy was cruel, that suffering was intentional, that hatred was justified and uncomplicated. With that certainty eroded, the armor feels heavy and ill-fitting. The prisoners must decide whether to maintain it out of habit or begin the painful process of adaptation. Neither choice feels safe. Some respond by retreating inward, clinging to silence and emotional withdrawal. They minimize engagement, avoid eye contact, and reduce their reactions to the bare minimum. This withdrawal is not resignation but self-protection. By limiting emotional investment, they hope to avoid the risk of moral confusion. Others take the opposite approach, observing more closely, engaging cautiously with the environment, seeking to understand the boundaries of this restraint. These prisoners are not more trusting, but they are more curious, compelled to make sense of what they are experiencing. The captor's behavior continues to exert pressure without direct force. By maintaining consistency, they remove the emotional spikes that normally punctuate captivity. Without dramatic highs or lows, the prisoners are left with a steady, unyielding reality that invites reflection. Reflection, in turn, opens space for questions that wartime psychology usually suppresses. Questions about responsibility, about choice, about the nature of obedience and authority begin to surface. One such question lingers persistently. If the captors can choose restraint, why do others choose cruelty? The prisoners have witnessed brutality elsewhere, both inflicted and endured. They know firsthand that war does not automatically strip away moral agency. The contrast forces them to consider the uncomfortable possibility that cruelty is often chosen, not inevitable. This realization does not absolve the war or its participants, but it complicates the moral accounting. As this realization settles, the prisoners experience a subtle shift in how they view power. Power no longer appears solely as the ability to harm. Instead, it reveals itself as the ability to refrain. The captor's authority feels heavier precisely because it is not constantly asserted through violence. The prisoners sense that they are subject to a system confident enough not to rely on spectacle. This confidence is unsettling because it suggests stability and intention rather than chaos. The emotional impact of this understanding accumulates slowly. It does not announce itself in moments of revelation but builds through repetition. Each day without humiliation reinforces the same message. Restraint is not accidental. The prisoners begin to accept this, not with relief but with resignation. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It means acknowledging reality as it is rather than as one expected it to be. With acceptance comes a deeper form of internal conflict. The prisoners must now reconcile their identity as victims with the recognition that their captors are exercising a form of moral discipline. This reconciliation is fraught. It threatens to undermine the simplicity of suffering narratives that offer psychological comfort. Victimhood, while painful, provides clarity. Complexity offers none. It demands nuance at a time when emotional resources are already depleted. This complexity also affects how the prisoners relate to one another. Conversations, when they occur, are cautious and fragmented. Some prisoners voice confusion or reluctant acknowledgement of fair treatment, only to be met with silence or quiet disagreement. Others refuse to discuss it at all, preferring to preserve a shared narrative of hostility. These differences create subtle fractures within the group, not dramatic conflicts but quiet divergences in perception. The captors, unaware or unconcerned with these internal struggles, continue their routines unchanged. Their indifference to the prisoner's moral turmoil reinforces the asymmetry of power. The prisoners realize that this internal reckoning is theirs alone to bear. No explanation will be offered, no reassurance given. The dignity on display is not meant to educate or persuade, it simply exists. Over time, the prisoners begin to understand that this form of captivity carries its own psychological cost. Without cruelty to resist, resistance itself becomes abstract. Without humiliation to endure, endurance becomes ambiguous. The prisoners are forced to confront themselves more directly, without the external pressure that usually justifies emotional collapse or defiance. This confrontation is quiet but relentless. In this stage, the war feels less like a clash of armies and more like a test of internal coherence. The prisoners are no longer fighting to preserve dignity against overt degradation. They are struggling to redefine dignity in a context where it has not been stripped away by force. This struggle is subtle, deeply personal, and ongoing. By the end of this chapter of experience, the prisoners are no longer merely shocked by restraint. They are burdened by it. The captor's dignity has introduced a moral weight that cannot be easily dismissed or resolved. It has disrupted the emotional economy of captivity, replacing fear-driven certainty with unresolved tension. The prisoners carry this tension forward, aware that something fundamental has shifted within them, even if they cannot yet articulate what that shift will ultimately mean. As captivity settles into routine, dignity reveals itself not as a momentary anomaly but as a persistent condition. Days no longer blur together solely through deprivation or fear but through repetition governed by restraint. The prisoners begin to notice that the tone of their confinement does not fluctuate with mood or circumstance. There are no sudden acts of cruelty to reassert dominance, no deliberate humiliations to remind them of their powerlessness. Instead, the same measured conduct continues, day after day, quietly reinforcing the reality that this restraint is not performative. It is embedded, structural, and unwavering. This consistency begins to reshape how the prisoners understand endurance. Previously, endurance had meant surviving hostility, absorbing insult, and hardening oneself against degradation. It was reactive, forged in opposition to cruelty. Now, endurance must be redefined. There is no constant provocation to push against, no obvious enemy behavior to resist psychologically. The prisoners are left to endure something less visible but equally demanding: the slow, unrelenting presence of respect within confinement. This form of endurance requires emotional recalibration, a reorientation toward patience rather than defiance. With this recalibration comes an unexpected fatigue. The prisoners discover that living under restrained authority demands a different kind of strength. Without cruelty to justify emotional numbness, feelings surface more readily. Long-suppressed grief, guilt, and longing emerge in the quiet spaces left by the absence of abuse. The mind, no longer consumed by immediate threats, turns inward. Memories of home, of unfinished lives, of comrades lost return with greater clarity. This inward turn is painful, yet unavoidable, and the prisoners must learn to endure it without the blunt anesthetic of rage. The captor's consistent dignity also alters the prisoner's relationship with time. Without dramatic events to punctuate the days, time stretches and compresses unpredictably. Hours feel longer, yet weeks pass almost unnoticed. The prisoners become acutely aware of routine, the timing of movements, the predictability of interactions, the reliability of procedures. This predictability brings a fragile sense of stability, but it also strips away the distractions that once made survival feel urgent and immediate. Survival now feels prolonged, contemplative, and heavy. In this environment, strength becomes quieter and less visible. It is found in maintaining composure without provocation, in preserving self-respect without external threat, in continuing to care about one's inner life despite confinement. These forms of strength are harder to measure and harder to share. They do not manifest in acts of resistance or defiance that can be witnessed by others. Instead, they unfold privately, within thought and memory, making them feel both deeply personal and isolating. The prisoners also begin to sense that dignity, when sustained, imposes its own discipline on them. Being treated with restraint makes emotional collapse feel less permissible, even though the suffering remains real. There is no humiliation to justify despair, no cruelty to excuse surrender. This unspoken pressure can feel oppressive, as though the captor's dignity has become a mirror reflecting expectations back onto the prisoners themselves. They feel compelled to hold themselves together, not because they are ordered to, but because the environment quietly demands it. This pressure gives rise to a new form of internal negotiation. The prisoners must decide how much of themselves to preserve, how much to let erode, and how much to rebuild in place of what has been lost. Some cling tightly to former identities, replaying memories of rank, profession, or family role as anchors against dissolution. Others allow those identities to soften, accepting that captivity has altered them in ways that cannot be undone. Both approaches carry costs, and neither offers certainty. The captor's restraint also influences how the prisoners perceive fairness. Rules are applied consistently, and while the rules themselves are restrictive, their predictability introduces a sense of order. The prisoners begin to understand the boundaries of their world with greater clarity. This understanding reduces fear but increases awareness of limitation. Knowing precisely where one stands does not liberate, but it removes illusion. The prisoners confront the reality of their situation without the emotional distortion of constant threat. As this clarity grows, so does reflection. The prisoners find themselves thinking not only about their own endurance but about the broader meaning of what they are experiencing. They consider how dignity functions within systems of power, how restraint can shape behavior without overt force. They begin to see captivity not merely as an absence of freedom but as an environment that tests internal coherence. The question shifts subtly from how long they can survive to who they are becoming as they do. This shift deepens the psychological weight of confinement. Endurance is no longer measured solely in days or weeks but in the ability to maintain a sense of self over time. The prisoners become aware that captivity, even without cruelty, can erode identity through monotony, dependence, and isolation. Dignity, while preserving humanity, does not shield against this erosion. It simply changes its texture, making it quieter and more gradual. Relationships among the prisoners also evolve under these conditions. Without shared outrage against cruelty, camaraderie becomes more subdued. Conversations turn inward, reflective, sometimes hesitant. Bonds still form, but they are based less on collective resistance and more on shared contemplation. Some prisoners find comfort in this quieter connection, while others miss the galvanizing force of common anger. The group dynamic becomes more fragmented, shaped by individual coping strategies rather than unified defiance. The captors remain distant, their dignity unchanged. They do not seek acknowledgement, nor do they attempt to explain their conduct. This silence reinforces the asymmetry of the situation. The prisoners' internal transformations unfold without recognition or validation. Dignity here is not a gift bestowed upon them but a condition imposed by example. It offers no consolation, only a framework within which suffering must be endured differently. Over time, the prisoners begin to recognize that this form of captivity leaves lasting marks. The absence of overt cruelty does not mean the absence of trauma. Instead, trauma accumulates through prolonged uncertainty, through the constant effort of emotional regulation, through the tension of holding complex moral realities without resolution. The prisoners sense that this experience will follow them beyond captivity, shaping how they understand authority, power, and humanity long after the war has ended.